Brother John a couple of days ago, and we were saying, how can you sum up the life of someone like Dan Turner in a 3 to 5 minutes that like Stephen gave us to speak? So I don't know that we're going to be on that time framework. So get comfortable and enjoy this day's continuing celebration of the most remarkable individual. I love Dan, partly because he was so doggone easy to love. Actually, I envied him. He was handsome, charming, witty, his eyes sparkled, he lit up the room whenever he walked in, he loved adventure, could discover the most amazing hiking trails, he could downhill ski rings around me. I admired how easily he could discuss anything from the Bible to Shakespeare, to James Joyce or one of his favorite authors, Thomas Merton, as well as wax eloquent about a hard-writing Western novel like Lonesome Dove, to even regaling a bawdy limerick every now and then. I was amazed how one minute he could expound on deep, sacred, spiritual thoughts, and the next moment we were touching on back alley humor, like the time we, I won't go into that. His humor, mimics, and laughter were a joy to witness. Perhaps some of that came from his being Irish, which I witnessed many years ago when I attended his father's funeral and ceremony at the cemetery. Being raised Protestant, I was fascinated by the many rituals not utilized by Protestants. In particular, I was focused on the priest and all the vestments, giving his final blessing to Dan's father. As the coffin was being lowered into the earth and holy water was being sprinkled on the coffin, the priest ends up by saying, "And finally, I'd like to conclude this ceremony by telling dear Harry one last joke." He proceeds to tell a joke. I didn't know what to think, and even felt a little bit embarrassed for Dan and his family. A little later, I sought out Dan for a private moment and inquired if he was angered by the priest's display of levity at such a solemn moment. Dan, of course, laughed at my interpretation and said, "Oh, no. My dad would have loved it," and got a good laugh out of it because the priest and his dad were always sharing jokes. So having acknowledged Dan's sense of humor, Dan and I met in 1974 under somewhat humorous circumstances. On a Friday night in the basement room of the Uptown Hull House on Beacon Street, we found ourselves together in a cramped room, cutting the cheese. We laughed out loud at what was transpiring. We thought the smell of the cheese was not all that awful, as it was emanating from a freshly unpacked 20-pound brick of Munster that just arrived from Wisconsin, and we were slicing, weighing, and wrapping it to be sold at that evening's Uptown Food Co-op, where we both volunteered every Friday. Uptown at that time grew people like Dan and Elizabeth, people who had caring hearts in their DNA and wanted to make a positive difference in people's lives. Back then, Uptown was like the Wild Wild West, with streams of migrants and refugees pouring in from the Deep South, Appalachia, Central America, Native American Indian reservations, folks placed into mental health and prisoner halfway houses, alcohol and drug treatment centers, runaway drop-in centers. Dan and Elizabeth felt home among all of them. Prior to meeting Dan that night, I had completed a master's degree in sociology, traveled to Europe, and ended up living in Uptown, not far from the Turners. Someone mentioned that Dan was a juvenile probation officer. So I asked him if I could pick his mind about the work he was doing. Dan and Elizabeth were recently married and living in a big old uptown on Malden Avenue at that point. I went over to Dan's one evening. He handed me a beer and we sat out on his outside back porch looking over the back alleys and night-lit streets of Uptown. He spoke passionately of working with juvenile car thieves, burglars, gang members, runaways, kids that were abused and neglected, and how a good probation officer could serve to help improve the lives of juveniles and families in those situations. I was hooked on the job and I was hooked on Dan. I went to work for the next 32 years as a juvenile probation officer where Dan worked. I became a supervisor and recently retired as a deputy chief in the department. And I dare say Dan was a catalyst from the very beginning. During Dan's days at juvenile court, he was always about social change and personal change. He helped develop the Court's Family System Training Program. He attended and helped develop seminars and workshops that impacted many people at the Court. Dan, along with his dear friend and fellow ex-priest Stanley Varsky, were the two most dynamic and skillful trainers of the Juvenile Probation Department. They were the Dan and Stan dynamic duo, and scores of probation officers earned their officer badges under Dan and Stan. And these trainees went on to help improve the lives of countless delinquent, neglected, and abused juveniles throughout Cook County. Dan helped me to remain positive and energetic in such a demanding field. You see, burnout, cynicism, and compassion fatigue could easily flourish against the work we were doing. Part of it was simply loving the work Dan introduced me. Part of it was a spiritual footing in life that Dan helped foster in me. And a seriously big part of it was having an active play life in the great outdoors. And Dan was there every step of the way. He was always a playmaster, always up for a celebration, and always quick to hit the great outdoors. He was someone that could easily transition from being a spiritual guru to the kid who was always up for a game of catch in the great outdoors. With Dan, play and work were almost synonymous. One flowed into the other. Whether it was our weekly volleyball games down by Montrose Beach in the summer, cross-country and downhill skiing in the winter, road trips to Wisconsin, Ohio, and West Virginia to raft the Gauley River, hiking through Yosemite Park, National Park, spontaneously running down to Rush Street to celebrate the Bears winning the Super Bowl. Dan was usually at the center of the festivities. And of course, through our annual canoe trips up to the Wilderness Boundary canoe area. It was an idyllic escape from the city and the intensity of our probation work. At night, we lit our corncob pipes and sipped Maker's Mark whiskey from the tin cups around the campfire, and we talked and laughed into the night as we piled on one another in a tent under the Northwood stars. One last story about Dan's spirit in the outdoors I'll never forget. He and I usually shared the organization of the trip, bought supplies, made lists, made reservations to our canoe place. However, I bought the Boundary Water maps and helped chart the new lake trails we would travel each year. But once on the water, the lakes and shorelines quickly look alike. Dan and I would often have energetic discussions about the location of the Portage Trailhead each time we encountered a new lake. And Stosh and Buffalo Head would sit back in the canoe and enjoy the energetic banter between Dan and myself. One year after setting up our campsite on a new lake, we decided to stretch our legs and hike deep into the forest away from the shoreline. We were mindful of bears and other creatures. Because of the uncharted and unspoiled woods, I thought, I better bring my compass so I could have a reference of our direction of travel for the return trip. And after almost an hour of hiking inland, we decided to turn around and head back to camp. Indeed, we were surrounded by the deep forest growth with no clear trail marker to guide us back to the camp. I proudly announced that I had been tracking our movement using the compass needle, which revealed our direction of travel, and all we needed to do was reverse the direction of travel according to the compass needle. And that would point us back to camp. I raised my arms, pointing a direction, and said, "That way will take us back to camp." Dan stepped forward and pointed in a significantly different direction and said, "No, that's the way." I argued, "The compass doesn't lie, and that is the proper direction. And what makes you think you know the way better than the compass that has been guiding explorers for 100 years?" Dan took a deep breath, stuck out his chest, slowly raised his arms in a Moses-like fashion, parting the Red Sea, and he said, "It's inside me. My spirit knows the way. This is the way." I snickered to myself and said, "Okay, Chief, you are the elder. Lead the way." As I thought to myself, now we are screwed, and we will be lost in the middle of the wilds, the deep woods, wandering around in the woods till God knows when. And of course, the Chief's spirit Were I born in the mountains, would I yearn to go higher? Would I go to the final reach off the earth? Were you there, my God, I would dare so. Were I wounded in the desert, would I seek the pathless waters? Would I lose myself to the sun, sink into dust? Were you there, my God, I would lose all of me. Were the mountains in my soul and deserts in my heart? Would I course the trackless ways to touch the high, holy image of your face? If you were there, are you there? And Dan, I thank you for always being there.
What an inspiring character Dan Turner is, and will continue to be a part of our lives. A source of inspiration, and also someone to continually touch our hearts. This is something of how Dan inspired me. Anyone who became a friend to Dan Turner felt as if we were his best friend, and perhaps each of us was, because Dan has such a big and loving heart. I have a friend and companion out in Hawaii, and Elizabeth came out to visit. She said, "Mike, say this. Dan is the least phony person I ever met, or would ever want to meet. He was a light, had a sense of innocence, never anything but himself, youthful and energetic." That's probably Sandal calling me now. He was a writer, a spirit man, who loved God and all her manifestations. To be with Dan was to have fun, laughter, and always an experience of getting to the heart of the matter, whether it be politics, cultural phenomena, violence, poverty, art, or institutional transgressions. Dan's character included a tremendous discerning talent in identifying dishonesty, someone being a phony, or using twisted logic. Dan wrote that there was a fire in my breast. He was truly passionate about social justice. Early in his career, as Chuck related, he spearheaded a program of re-education and renewal for juveniles, offenders of the law. Dan had another passion and reverence for nature. His respect and love of nature began as a youth in a prairie on the south side of Chicago, and his intimate connection with that piece of earth carried over throughout his life. I remember getting books from Dan, one entitled Chaos Theory, another one, Plant Communications. If someone asked Dan, "What do you mean by nature?" Dan would get charged and inspired to say something like, "Well, everything is alive and interrelated. The earth, the sun, the moon, ants, the birds, the sky, human beings as evolution's most marvelous manifestation of life, the myriad universes